Hi, everyone. It's Kenneth Wever again, and I'm here and I want to talk about trauma and how to be trauma informed in our practices. I do want to say that these are all coming from my personal opinion. My opinion is resourced and informed by I have 10 years of experience in the social work field. I've worked with in a shelter for traumatized children. I've supervised programs there. I've trained staff on how to work with traumatized children. I trained all of the incoming staff for several years, as well as I'm a counselor now. I've worked with both victims and perpetrators of different forms of violence. So just to say it's an informed opinion, but nonetheless, my opinion. So I'm not an expert on this, but I am going to share a lot of the things that have really changed the game for my understanding of trauma, not only in my own life, but in how to support others who have experienced trauma. So, the first thing I think we have to do is to define what is trauma. And when we think about trauma, typically, again, this isn't Webster's definition from a dictionary, but just a working definition is that, people are talking about an intense event or series of events that happened that had a negative, lasting impact for somebody. And that this negative, lasting impact has impacted this person's ability to build healthy relationships, to, function in society in a normal way sometimes, to have jobs, to commit to things, right? These lasting impacts have done just that, right? Impacted this person's ability to live a life as they want to. So when we think about a trauma-informed approach, right, we're working with somebody as a whole person, right? So if the service that we're providing, let's say as an agency that's trauma-informed, if we're providing housing, this would mean that not only are we providing housing, but we're considering that a lot of the folks that we're providing these services for might have experienced really intense things. So we're going to train staff on those things. So that's us using this term generally. So when it comes to being trauma informed with our own practice and our practices we share with others, right? We're working with the whole person and we're leaving space open for the experiences that they've had and the ways that they've coped with them, right? So maybe the reactivity around certain topics, maybe the lack of resources, maybe there's certain topics that are just off limits. They're not going to react, they're going to disconnect, right? So being trauma informed, it means that we're fully considering taking that into account. Not only like are we aware of it, but we're planning for it, right? Where we have specific strategies for how to go there with great skill. And I'm going to talk about those things. So the next thing that I think is really important about trauma is that we're not talking about the specific event necessarily, but we are talking about the results of that event. And so I'll give this in an example. So let's say there's 10 folks that all are involved in a car crash. You know, it's a pileup in the freeway somewhere. Certain folks were driving, certain folks were passengers, certain folks maybe were asleep in the car. And because of all the different factors that are present, let's say that five of these folks, let's also say none of these people were seriously injured, um, other than some bumps, scratches, bruises. But let's say five of these folks, whether they were driving, whether they were asleep or passengers, five of these folks had very little adverse or negative reactions to this event. And what I mean by that, in less fancy words, is that, they kind of went home. They were like, whoa, that was scary. Wasn't that crazy? They go to sleep. They wake up the next day. They're still kind of like, oh. And then that's kind of it. Maybe the next time they're driving, they find that their body kind of tenses up a little bit. They kind of think about that situation. Let's say if it was snowing or raining, next time they're extra cautious. They just kind of feel a little bit of a tension come over when they see those road conditions. But let's say that two folks that were in that crash, again, we can guess randomly. Maybe both of these folks are drivers. Maybe they just had like zero importance based on this event. So let's say these two people went home, had a hamburger, and were like, if anybody asked them about their day, they're like, "Oh, it was pretty good." Like, weren't you involved in a crash? And they're like, "Yeah, we spun like 3 times, flipped over twice." But, you know, it happens, right? And without um any kind of pretense, they're not like just trying to be cool. They're also not disconnected from it. But let's say that these two people are just like, it happens. It was crazy. No one got hurt. It could have been crazier. They're just good. And then let's say the last, three folks here, they do have an adverse reaction to this. And what I mean by that is they go home, and the second that they're in home in a safe place, they have a full-fledged panic attack. During the crash, they were kind of just outside of their body. They get home, they are like in bed for 2 days. They decide internally that they're never going to drive again. They, get scared when they see intense driving in movies. Maybe they just don't talk about this event ever again, or maybe they talk about it all the time, right? And so if we think of these 10 folks, right, these 10 imaginary people that we're speaking about in this car crash, all of these different reactions were for the same event. Yes, they had different circumstances. And even if they had the very same circumstances, let's say they were in a bus, all 10 of them were passengers. It's the resources I have for this event. It's the intensity of the event and my vulnerability during the event that makes it traumatic or not traumatic. The event in and of itself isn't necessarily traumatic. And so what I would say is that actually, I think every day we experience all kinds of things that could potentially be traumatic. And maybe not every day, but every year or so, we experience events that can really halt our nervous system and really our lives. Yet, for whatever reason, and we'll unpack that, I had resources around this event. And so I'm probably either like, whoa, that was crazy, or I'm like, eh. They're like, hey, Ken, didn't you get involved in a fight? And I'm like, yeah, kind of. Wait, which fight? Right? You're just like, what? They're like, hey, man, didn't you get in a car crash? And you're like, which crash? The first one or the second one? And then they're like, what? 2 crashes? You're like, yeah. Like, it's that there's the appropriate amount of attention there given, but there's also the ability to have an identity that exists beyond this thing, right? When we're under-resourced, we talk about this thing, or we never talk about this thing, but it's because we don't have an identity outside of it. And I'm going to break this down more. So what's important here to consider is what was at risk, or what was the thing that lacked resources. And I'll give more examples about this. So a lot of the folks that I work with, let's say if they were to talk about where they grew up, or living situations, oftentimes they'll have memories of their parents that are very specific, so I'll come up with an example. Let's say they might have a lot of memories of their father's outbursts, big outbursts of anger, of aggression, maybe throwing things. And so these are peaks in their father's behavior. And so what I'm saying is that it's not the peak that makes it traumatic, but it's the lack of other resources. So it's not my father's anger that is traumatic. It's the fact that that's the only father I knew. Right? That's the trauma, is that if dad's anger had been textured and filled out with a lot of kindness, with an apology, with dad being like, hey, I wish I had handled that differently. Or, you know, dad gets angry sometimes, but that's not your fault. That's dad's fault. You know, I'm working on that. And it's hard. It's a really big emotion for me. Right? If we had had those experiences, then the anger would not be minimized, but it would be filled out. So again, you know, in that example with the car crash, again, I'm going to use my imagination here. It could be that somebody is traumatized because of the lack of control, right? They heard the sound of tires screeching. They felt the vehicle moving and the lack of control. They heard sounds that were really loud. They were injured. So it's not the lack of control in that moment that makes it so traumatic. Or I'll say that's the it is the lack of control in that moment that makes it so traumatic, but it's the lack of control everywhere else. So it is the fact that I don't have control here, but it's the fact that I've never really felt in control of my life, of my choices, of my body. That's what makes this car crash so particularly devastating for that person, is the lack of resources to show up for this particular event. While the inverse of somebody else is like, I kind of go with the flow. They're like, yeah, we spun 3 times. I mean, the first one was pretty scary. The second two are pretty cool, actually. Right? Like their ability to resource around that is their ability to relinquish control, because there's these moments where they do feel full control and they can trust the lack of control. Hope this is making sense. The next thing to consider is how we can work with trauma in the body. And I want to be really clear that it's in our body. I think a lot of the theories that we have around trauma, at least as a community, right, is that they're up here, that they're conscious. You know, that it's like, oh, this person's not getting over this thing. That they're, you know, that they're stuck. And I think it's more complex than that. It's our nervous system. And to define nervous system, it's the parts of our body, the very subtle connections between our brain and our body, but then also body to body, right? So there's our central nervous system, which is generally our brain and our spinal cord. And then there's our peripheral nervous system, which is like how information travels from like one part of my body to the next part. So it's in our nervous system. It's our body that stores this information, and it stores it because of the lack of safety. And here, I think it's important to begin to think about what part of the brain, right? So when we think about the brain, there's the neocortex or the frontal lobe. And this part of our brain's in charge of high level thinking. You know, I think in our neocortex, which is incredible, you know, we can not only think higher level thoughts, but we can even think about the fact that we're thinking, right? Like mind blowing. There's the limbic brain, this midbrain right here. This, generally speaking, is in charge of emotions. When we think about the back part of our brain, the brain stem is one of the ways that they call it. There's other organs there. This part of our brain is the oldest part of our brain. It's also the fastest part of our brain. It's the part of our brain that reacts the quickest. The other parts of our brain kind of need a few more seconds to respond. This part of our brain is in charge of, they call it the autonomic system. So it's in charge of everything that is automatic, quote unquote, right? So meaning our heartbeat, meaning our digestion, how big our veins, whether they're dilated or constricted. This part of our brain is in charge of survival. So when our body feels unsafe, when something scary happens, this is the part of the brain that reacts because it's the fastest. It's also, I would say, the one that is most skilled in going into those places. I think about, little things that happen growing up or as an adult, right? But, you think about, you reach out and you touch a hot stove. If that's ever happened to you and it happens really quickly, right? You touch the stove, your hand moves back instantly. Then you feel pain. Then you feel fear. And then you think, screw that thing, right? Then you think, I'm never going back there again. I hate that place, right? And I think that's very important, is that often the recoil response or the jump response happens first. Then we feel the thing in our body. Then our nervous system reacts to say like, ouch, it's quadrant 5, ouch. Then we feel something in response to the ouch, which is like, oh, that was scary, actually. That came out of nowhere. There's a lot more stoves here, man. Any of these could burn me. And then the next thing is a thought, right? Which is just that, maybe like, oh, maybe I don't want to be here anymore. And I would say that they're all built on one another. So when we think about the nervous system, when we think about that's the communicating aspects for our body, right? But when we think about the brain stem back here, it's just worried about, am I safe? Am I unsafe? And the language of safety for our nervous system is, do I feel relaxed? The language for unsafe is there tension? Is there constriction? So once our body gets to relax, the nervous system communicates like, oh, we're good. Start digesting. Instead of having our blood flowing through our muscles, right, which is kind of why we feel butterflies in our stomach, it's like, actually, we can digest, we can hang out, we can eat, we can feel pleasure, we can feel good. When our nervous system is on high alert, right, when I feel unsafe, that's when all of the muscles constrict. I'm ready to fight or flight. I'm ready to run. So what we can do is we can communicate with these aspects in the language that they understand. So for our body and our nervous system, the language is relaxation. That's how it defines safety. For our brainstem, what's important here, and I'll give more examples if you're not following me, what's happening here is that there's a few other things that are happening. Is that not only is it the thing that happened, right? So the we can say the initial shock about it, right? But it's the thing that I'm assuming is taking place, right? And I think the other thing that's important to say is that this is biological, this is normal, this is, I would say, it's even a good thing. It just has to be refined, right? But I would say we've survived as a human species because of our brainstem, because of overreaction, because of assumption, right? That our brainstem has created safety that way. I think about that a lot. I like hiking. And so at times when I'm hiking, I'm like walking through. I do walk funny apparently. But if I'm walking through the desert, here we have a lot of rattlesnakes. I'm in Tucson, Arizona, so I have to look out for those. And sometimes if I see a stick on the floor, my nervous system, my body instantly responds and I jump. And I think about that. And instead of feeling silly, I'm like, yes, my nervous system rather jump 100 times and look dumb than not jump the one time that there's an actual rattlesnake. So again, overreaction and assumption is tied to survival. And yet, there's many times that I feel in danger when I'm actually not, or I'm in survival mode when it's not necessary. So, the next thing that I think is important here to consider is that the nervous system, and in particular the brainstem, uses sensation, right? What's in my body? Where is there tension? Am I relaxed? But it also uses images. And the example I like to give here is Again, if I was walking in the desert, or if I was walking in the woods and I hear a growl, if I hear a growl, my mind is gonna imagine a little bear. And so I'm gonna see a little image of a bear or a mountain lion, and maybe it's like chewing my arm, right? And that's why I run so fast, is because that's the assumption, right? That's the image. The feeling in my body is tension because of the growl, but the image is now a bear. And furthermore, a bear that's gonna hurt me, right? And if we were to remove that image, I would have to hear the growl and then see a paw. And I'm like, well, like, is it a bear? Is it not a bear? I'm like, it's just one paw. You know, maybe I see both paws and I see the bear and it's growling at me. Without the assumption of our nervous system, we'd be like, but is it hungry though? Like, what if it's a nice bear, right? I don't think anyone in the history of anything has ever had that response. Who knows? Maybe trained people do, right? But generally, if something scares us and then it actually shows up, we run or we try to fight it, right? The fight response would be, you know, I might be walking in the woods and I see a bear and it's trying to fight me, but it's like a baby bear, and I'm like, I could take this bear. But if maybe mama bear comes up, I'm like, ooh, I can't take mama bear. I'm gonna run. And then I see two other bears pop up on my right side. The next response is that there's a freeze response. So it's fight, flight, or freeze. There's also a few other responses, but these are the ones I'll talk about. The freeze response means that I'm identifying, typically not consciously, that I can't fight this thing. I can't successfully run from it. So I better play dead. That's the process, or it's actually that I've overwhelmed my possibilities, meaning that I have ran or I did fight and I got caught. And my nervous system feels so overwhelmed that it actually shuts down, it actually collapses. So, you know, I think it's important to start to understand that the energy of those responses of either fighting or running are external, but there's also an internal freezing and a collapsing. The reason it's important is because trauma isn't the fighting or the running, it's actually the collapsing and the stuck. The image I like to use a lot for trauma is that it's like ice. It's like a block of ice. It can be melted, it can be like broken up. It's solid though. Trauma is a response and a solidification of that response. So what I mean by that, if we stay with that example of the crash, let's say, let's stay with the example of the crash, right? It's the solidification of like, I don't ever want to feel out of control anymore. I'm unwilling to feel out of control. I'm unwilling to be in things that remind me of that lack of control, right? It's all really solid stuff, right? So that's why I don't drive anymore. That's why I don't like watching movies about driving. That's why I don't like seeing cars that much. They kind of make my stomach hurt, right? It's because all of this stuff is super solid here. The responses to it, the responses to it in active would be, it's me pushing away. The fighting would be talking to my children about not driving anymore. I would be like, yo, driving's dumb. Stay home all the time, right? That's me trying to fight it. There might also just be disconnection, which would be an example of that would be like, I never talk about this thing, you know, or the opposite being like, I talk about it all the time. But the block itself is the complete and utter lack of control, the collapsing of those energies. That's the stuckness. It's the freeze response where we get traumatized. It's not in the fighting, it's not in the fleeing, it's in the collapsing. So when we work with trauma, sometimes we do have to ride the anxiety, the intensity in the fight or the flight. We have to support our body. It's really complex. We have to support our body in feeling safe, first of all, creating big safety references for safety. The word that they use is titration, meaning that I feel safe, and then I touch into the experience just as much as that starts to feel a little bit intense, and then I pull back. And then once again, I resource, I feel good. That could be using essential oils, that could be using flower essences, that could be using touch. There's other practices like orientation, which is I look around the space that I'm in and I just gather my attention. I'm just letting myself know that I'm safe. I'm actually letting my brainstem know that I'm safe. Um, One thing that they encourage is like to look around and look at colors, noticing colors that you enjoy, right? So you kind of reground the nervous system. The other thing that is possible is that I can start working with the story itself. The cool thing about energy work as it relates to trauma and being trauma informed is that we can work directly with resourcing the area that was vulnerable. So if I felt scared in this crash because of the lack of control, I can start providing new reference points for the control that I actually do have. Start creating safety there. So with the body, there's specific approaches. With our nervous system more generally, with our brainstem more generally, there's different things that I can do. So I'm gonna share these really quickly. So I'll say it one more time, right? With the body, we can orient. We could, you do this for 5 minutes, just look around the room, feel your breath. You can even like touch your skin and allow these things to feel good. As you look around your room, allow that to feel nice, to feel pleasant. Next, when I start to touch into an emotion that's big or an experience that's really big, I can pull away when it's too much so I don't get stuck again or overwhelm my system again. I'm actually trying to build my capacity, not overwhelm it. And then the next is like having techniques for discharging. And generally these are very physical. You could see people will move, they'll kind of like intentionally shake their hands. Um, they can do tapping, which Miriam took us through earlier this week. So that's how to support the body. When we are working with the more subtle and energy work in particular, we can work directly with the story and with the resources around that story. So I'll share this now. And if you in practice work with this, what we first do with the story is and I've been sharing these principles before, so they'll sound familiar, right? The first thing we do with the story is that we just honor and validate it. I'm going to stick with this car crash story. So I would just honor that, yeah, that was really scary. We had zero control over how that happened. I really don't like feeling out of control. That's really scary. We give it space for that experience. We can imagine and allow for other examples of lack of control to show up in front of us. I might ask myself, when was the first time I felt no control over my body? When those experiences pop up, I like to let them be like little pictures. We can gather the lessons from these experiences. The reason we gather the lesson is so that it can release fully. When we gather the lessons, we can bring energies to begin to like wash over and release these pictures. To keep it simple, imagine that we just bring like really beautiful golden cosmic energy and we start collapsing all of the pictures that reinforce the story that I'm out of control. As these pictures start to release, imagine that we allow, and it might be difficult, but we allow our inner wisdom to think of, what about moments where I have felt in control? And what if these moments can just be highlighted? Another cool thing I like to do sometimes is use my imagination. So if I have an image of this crash, you can move the image back. You can like dim the image. You can make it really small. And you can make images of safety and in control. You can make those bigger. You can highlight those more. Good. And that's just a little skill. Obviously, the topic of trauma is really big. If you're working with your own trauma or the trauma of others, I highly recommend that you 100% be committed and be highly skilled to do so. If you know that you've experienced something really big, I would say don't jump into it. Have somebody with great skill to support you. This could be somebody that you pay, like a practitioner. It could be through therapy. It could be a friend, but it's a place that's under resourced. Generally speaking, we won't have the resources to go somewhere under resourced, which is why it was under resourced in the first place. So we have to have a new nervous system, a new reference person to kind of help build the skills out of there. That's how, for me, how therapy, how counseling, how even energy work works, is that this person has skills that I don't have. So I would just say once again, that this is all just coming from my personal experience, from books I've read, from classes I've taken, from 10 years of experience. So it's informed opinion, but nonetheless, my opinion. If any of this stuff felt triggering, you can like just let it go. Just be like, Ken made it up. If any of this is really helpful, you can hold on to it, make it your own, learn and study more about it. But I hope this was helpful to you all. Thank you. Bye.